Hey guys, Mike here from Movie Nation.
And today we're going through a 1994 romance comedy movie called Milk Money. The movie commences with three boys named Frank, Brad and Kevin having a night out. In Frank's treehouse, they all make very absurd jokes about their past experiences. Frank starts their meeting, telling the boys to bring out stuff they'd like to put in their time capsule. Kevin submits a diaphragm. Brad brings his sister's tweezers and Frank submits a picture of his mother. The next day, Frank takes a bath in his bathroom with some music on. He tries dancing but falls on the floor. Then, he preps for school and checks on his dad. During breakfast, Frank's dad catches his son reading some magazines. Upon noticing this, he has a talk with his son. You know, the talk about girls and stuff. After their fruitless talk, Frank gets to school and meets Brad at the entrance. Moments later, they meet Stacy, the one Frank has a crush on, and Holly, the one who has a crush on Frank. They exchange pleasantries with Stacy trying to invite Brad to the dance. Brad answers Stacy's request and talks to her privately before joining his other buddies, Frank and Kevin. Up next, the trio is seen watching a movie as they snack on some food at Kevin's. Then, Brad tells his clique about the nightclubs in the city. He tells them they'd be free to do anything in the city as long as they had $100. Then, a couple of scenes pass by with the boys trying to make money in school. During lunch one afternoon, Stacy asks Brad what they all needed the money for. Kevin almost spills the beans. Thankfully, Frank comes in clutch. After school, the three kids ride to the city with smiles on their faces. Eventually, the guys finally catch a glimpse of the skyscrapers in the city. Kevin gets cold feet but follows his boys nonetheless. The three boys finally arrive in the city and park their bicycles in an alleyway before moving further into the city on foot. They try asking some women to show some fun for cash and get slapped in return. Then, one hobo cajoles the boys into a dark parking lot and tries to rob them of their money. Thankfully, a lady named V saves the trio from the robber. Apparently, she was pleasing a man in the car parked directly beside the thief. Upon opening the door and knocking out the robber, the man orders his driver to take them away, leaving V behind. With reality dawning on V, she leaves the kids who are astonished over her figure and revealing clothes. The kids get to their senses and run out of the parking lot. Outside, Frank sees V standing in a corner and talks to her about their business in the city. Frank manages to convince V to show them her merchandise for $100. V reluctantly agrees, boards a taxi with the boys, and takes them to a room. Inside the room, V turns down the lights, sleeps on the bed and shows the boys some fun. Frank closes his eyes while the others watch in admiration. After their business inside the room, the boys hit the streets only to see their bikes have been stolen. Meanwhile, V walks to her boss's place. Cash, her boss, chastises her for bringing $100 to him that day. The two exchange words for a while and Cash leaves. After he's gone, V borrows Cash's car and drives it. She sees the boys on the streets and offers them a ride to their home. She drops off Kevin and Brad first before dropping Frank. After dropping Frank off, V finds out her car was faulty and couldn't start. She steps into Frank's house to borrow his phone as they discuss Frank's mom. As they discuss, Frank's father arrives home and meets the beautiful young V. When asked what and who V was by his father, Frank lies that she was Kevin's math teacher and that she offered him a ride but her car broke down upon reaching their house. Frank's father Tom thinks V decides to help her fix her car. He gets out of the home and starts fixing her car. V gets to him and has the most awkward conversation ever with Tom. Upon noticing they'd have to leave fixing the car till the next day, V decides to trek back to the city. She gets there by nightfall and passes by Stacy, Holly and some other girls on the way. They all admire the poise and elegance of V. She stops on the way and gets ice cream from Frank, who told her he'd been stalking her ever since. Then, the girls approach V and Frank to talk to them. Frank's surprised as V helps him get some representative from the girls. That night, Frank sets up his treehouse for V to sleep in. He gets her some clothes and talks with her. As they talk, Frank tells V that he'd like her to marry his dad. V is reluctantly giving the type of person she is, but Frank insists. The next day, Frank tells his friends that V slept in the treehouse. They don't believe him and place a bet on her bailing on them before they get back home. Frank bets Brad's leather jacket if V stays with them and he agrees. In the next scene, V can be seen enjoying the facilities of Frank's house while Frank faces detention in school and is told to give an oral presentation about the female reproductive system. Back at home, V finds out her boss Cash has been terminated. She calls Betty and tries to find info from her. Betty was already being held captive by Walter, the boss of V's boss, and tried to lure V to meet Walter. V catches on to this and makes a break for the town. She finds out her car hasn't been fixed yet and rides a Nike to Tom's conservation project. the wetlands and finds Tom with about 20 kids teaching them how to save their land. V meets up with Tom and marvels at how understanding and gentle he was in front of the 20 kids present. Then, they both see a bird and say the name simultaneously. This amuses both of them as they connect deeply in front of the children. After they both snap out of it, V decides to stay with Frank and Tom as she rides the bike back home. In the next scene, the trio gets to Frank's house and meets V in the bathtub. They all express surprise as Frank gets Brad's jacket for winning the bet. Frank discusses the conditions of V staying with them and she agrees with his terms. Up next, Frank has dinner with his dad and they discuss his mom. The next day, Frank puts on Brad's jacket and becomes the hottie in class. He tricks his teacher into getting out of the classroom while he uses V as a live subject for his oral presentation. Frank starts his presentation but doesn't get a chance to finish as his teacher breaks back into class with V escaping from the window. Afterward, Tom arrives back home to see V dressed in some of his wife's clothes. He smiles, asks V out on a date and enters his house. Shortly afterward, Frank steps out and talks with V, who gives him a locket. By nightfall, V and Tom walk around the street as they discuss things specific to one another. Things get excited between the two of them as they kiss, leaving their spectators, Holly and her family, amazed. Then, they stop and walk back home. On the way, they meet Kevin and his family. V recognizes Mr. Smith right off the bat. Seems like they've been close buddies once before. She tries to introduce herself, but Mr. Smith tries to take his family away. V then introduces herself as the dance instructor of Mr. Smith and Tom Oz and surprised that his date could teach math and dance as well. V's clearly disappointed after realizing that Tom didn't really know what she did for a living. She runs away and tries to drive away. Upon realizing her car's yet to be fixed, Tom follows her and tries to talk to her. V then takes Tom to Frank's treehouse where she explains that that's where she lives. Tom is surprised as listens to his date tell him about her real job. Upon finding out his son's been hanging out with an escort, he chastises V for not telling her the truth earlier. V tries to explain to him that she thought Frank told him her real profession and that he was fine with that. Tom leaves the treehouse annoyed that night. Frank and his dad have an argument over V. Frank tries to explain to him that V's the right woman for him and Tom stands his ground. Frank tells his dad that V was in love with him and that he should give her a second chance at life. Meanwhile, V's at the treehouse crying softly. That night, Tom tries to stop V from leaving them. As they argue, they see Frank rushing out of the house to throw away the necklace V gave him and his time capsule with tears in his eyes. Poor Frank just wanted someone he could call mom. This touches the duo as they walk over to the dumpster, bring out the box and find out the contents in there. The diaphragm, V's locket and a picture of Frank's mother. This touches V and Tom's hearts as they both get back to the treehouse. There, they talk for a little while as Tom tells V about his deceased wife. This arouses V so much that she starts crying over Tom's misfortune. Just then, Tom kisses V, who tells him her real name was Eve. Then, the two make out. At that moment, Mr. Smith makes a call to Betty and Walter, Cash's boss, telling them he saw V over at Middleton. Before they could get V's exact location, Mr. Smith hangs up. Walter, who was on his way somewhere, immediately changes course and continues driving. The next morning, Frank sees his dad and V in their home garden. He immediately remembers he has to recover his time capsule, but V shows him the necklace. Then, the duo reconciles and gets down to the business of the day. V teaches Frank how to dance. They have fun all through their dance session before going out to get groceries. During their shopping session, Walter enters the supermarket. Thankfully, V catches him before it is too late and puts on shades. Frank catches on and helps V out before Walter almost catches her. Moments later, Walter leaves the supermarket. Then, they rush back to their home. Back at home, V says her goodbyes to Frank as she has to leave town before Walter catches and hurts her and Tom's family. V dresses up, takes $50 from Tom's wallet and walks away. That night, Frank gets to the dance and V is already on her way out of town. Tom finally figures out what was wrong with the car and he runs inside to tell V what was wrong with the car. He sees nobody and drives over to where he might find his love interest. At the dance, Frank sees Brad and Stacy together. He's heartbroken and talks with his other friend Kevin. Unknown to Frank, Holly, who had a crush on him, was waiting for Frank to notice her. All of a sudden, V enters the school dance and steals the dance floor with V. Tom drives his way to Frank's school as the slow music kicks off. Meanwhile, Frank walks over to Stacy, Holly and Brad. He gives Stacy Brad's jacket and asks Holly for a dance. This surprises everybody as Brad quickly claims his girl for the night, Stacy. Back outside, Walter and Betty arrive at the school with Walter storming into the building. Just then, someone comes in and chastises Tom for bringing a prostitute like V to the school dance. Tom punches him and gets into a fight with him. As the crowd gathers to watch the fight, Walter takes V and drags her to a corner to demand his money back. V tells him she didn't steal his money and Walter tells her the money's in the car. Meanwhile, Frank takes the car keys from his father's wallet during the fight, pulls on the fire alarm and runs out of the building to drive the car home. Kevin takes V with Brad following as they storm out to meet Frank in V's car. Upon entering the car, Frank drives through the streets. Walter gets out of the school and pursues Frank and V while they drive. V tries to take the wheels from Frank and accidentally breaks the steering wheel. Then, the car goes into a speeding frenzy as they race to a train track, almost getting hit by a train. Thankfully, they manage to stop their car before things get out of hand. They all get out of the car fine, but the car catches fire. Tom and the fire alarm arrive just in time to stop an explosion. Meanwhile, V's gone. The next morning, V arrives at Jerry's house, telling him to release her so she can live her life. Jerry lets her off the hook and she leaves almost immediately. Up next, V is back in her room when she sees a familiar school bag. She's about to leave her room when she checks the bag and sees Walter's money. In the next scene, Tom chains himself to his car in an attempt to stop the contractors from bulldozing the wetlands. The cops on the scene warn to arrest him if he proves stubborn. However, Tom refuses and they proceed to arrest him. Thankfully, V and her lawyer arrive just in time to show them the deeds to the wetlands she bought in Tom's name. The contractors leave the land as Tom and V reunite with each other. They lock lips before V leaves the wetlands. The movie ends when she answers Frank's age-old question by telling him the only place where one can touch a woman that'll make her go crazy is her heart. Thanks for watching, guys.